Chapter 7. Ramsey. At first it seemed as though Ramsey's rage would last a lifetime, the fury burning white-hot in his belly, and bubbling to the surface with every savage kick, every hack of his blade, every blow he inflicted upon the ruins of their supposed thieves' haven. He stomped back and forth until his footsteps had traced deep grooves in the sandy floor, ranting and threatening the unknown villains who had plundered their hideout. Finally, when there was nothing left on land on which he could take out his anger, he stormed wordlessly past his crew and into his cabin on the Magpie's wing. For the first time any of them could recall, they heard the door lock click, and then an eerie silence seemed to spread out until it permeated the entire cavern. Rathbone leaned against the ship's railings, with his head in his hands, staring moodily upward through two of the arches and watching the seagulls wheeling overhead. After being spooked by Ramsey's rampage, echoing up from the caves below, they were now cautiously returning to their perches, their grey-white bullet heads peering reproachfully down through the gaps between the stone. Rathbone heard a scraping behind him and turned to see Shan dragging a large chest out of the hold. With everything that had happened, he'd forgotten the plunder they'd taken aboard. "Where are you going with that?" he asked gloomily, making no move to assist. "You don't really think you'll let us stay here now, do you?" This was accompanied by a tilt of the head toward the darkened windows of the cabin. "Not now that our little secret's out." "Oh, things will look better in the morning," Shan replied, cheerfully. "It's like my old dad used to say, when someone knocks you down, it's no good lying there feeling sorry for yourself. You've got to get back up and spit in their eye." He was a bit of a brawler, my dad. Rathbone permitted himself a thin smile. "Good in a tussle, was he?" Shan paused. "Never saw him win a fight. Still, had all his own teeth, though." "Well, that's, He used to keep them in a jar by his bed. For luck, he said." Rathbone stared at Shan for a moment and wished for the 1,000th time that he could tell whether or not the man was joking. Finally, he gave an exasperated sigh and moved to help with the cargo. Together, they carried the haul into the deepest recesses of the caves, a large, bowl-shaped room open to the sky, but almost completely enclosed by a canopy of trees, so that only slivers of sunlight made it through. The floor was covered in a thick carpet of leaves, twigs, and moss, and it was here that Shan dropped suddenly to his knees and began to root around on all fours. Rathbone watched incredulously, deciding what insult he should hurl in Shan's direction, then spotted the glint of metal from underneath the leaves. Shan grasped a large iron ring in his hands and tugged as hard as he could, and the hidden trapdoor sprang open in a cloud of dust and mold. Beneath it was a square of inky blackness into which a rope ladder descended, and Shan dropped into it with an easy familiarity. Rathbone shook off his surprise and moved to join him, easing himself onto the ladder and clambering cautiously into the hidden chamber below. The little room they were in was cramped and lit only by a lamp perched on a craggy ledge overhead. But Rathbone could just about make out the shapes of boxes and barrels in the gloom. A few cannonballs, a chest of gold or two, a pittance compared to everything they'd lost, but the foundations of a new fortune nevertheless, all squirreled away by their consummate quartermaster. "Does Ramsey know about this?" he breathed, his voice sounding strange to his own ears as the echo bounced back and forth. Shan shook his head. "Never got around to telling him. Besides, it's not really finished yet. I was hoping to turn this place into a proper workshop and get a few of my special projects ready first." He indicated a few scraps of paper and a handful of books, most of which seemed to be about tripwires, spring-loading mechanisms, intricate locking mechanisms, and Rathbone squinted to get a clearer look. What appeared to be a crude drawing of a man sticking out of a cannon. "You are a very strange person," said Rathbone slowly. "But I think I agree with you. Pirates just don't turn tail at the first sign of trouble. Let's get the wing unloaded and take a proper look at what we've got left." "Les," Shan agreed. "And then you can show me where you've been hiding the good drink." "Damn." "Mercia?" Mercia, who'd been sitting cross-legged at the map table, staring dreamlike at her charts and notations without taking in a single word, jumped slightly at the sound of her name. Ramsey was framed in the stairwell, his huge figure outlined there in an unusually weary pose. "Am I disturbing you?" he asked. Coming from the typically loud and boisterous Ramsey, the question seemed absurd. Mercia had to fight the urge to laugh. "Not at all, Captain. Please, join me." "Just Ramsey will do for now," he said, moving to straddle the opposing bench. "I haven't behaved much like a captain today." Mercia tilted her head at that. "You got us out of an ambush without so much as a scratch, and filled our hold while you were at it. That's the captain I'm used to. Besides, we both know how much we've still got buried out there. What was taken from us here was nothing more than spare change, if you think about it." If Ramsey was cheered by the attempt at a compliment, he didn't show it. "It's not about how much was taken, not really," he said carefully. "I gave up everything to come here because I believed that the Sea of Thieves would be a better way of living. That we'd have freedom, that we'd make discoveries, and find ways to live how we wanted to live without making the same old mistakes." Ramsey paused and took a deep swig from a mostly empty bottle Mercia hadn't even realized he was holding, before continuing. "When I was very small, my father told me a story about a village, a magic village, that only appeared in our world for one day every 100 years. Whenever it appeared, the people in that village wouldn't have aged a day. Just them and their village, contented as the rest of the world happened by." "And you hoped the Sea of Thieves could be like that village?" Mercia said sympathetically. Ramsey nodded. "Somewhere that the pirate life could always exist, even if the rest of the world fell under the rule of law and people forgot what it meant to be free. Now, we finally have that place. And what are we doing? Wasting time and supplies on petty squabbles, stealing from one another, when there's still so much to see and do. Although..." He took another deep draught from his bottle and wiped his lips on the back of his sleeve, looking at Mercia slyly with just a hint of his old vigor returning. "There is one way this place is like that village. You've noticed it too, even if you won't admit as much." Mercia groaned. "Please, Ramsey, not this again." She threw up her hands in exasperation. "Yes, I'll admit I've heard some strange tales in recent months, and yes, we've all encountered things that are hard to explain. That doesn't mean we have to stop believing in magic." Ramsey pressed, earning an exasperated sigh. "Well, if it isn't magic, I can think of no one better suited to find out what it is than you, Mercia, with your books, your brains, and your natural philosophy. Remember the first night we arrived, and you told me about the importance about keeping an open mind? Here's what we're going to do," he continued firmly, even as an irritated Mercia opened her mouth to interject. "At first light, we're going to set sail, and we're going to visit every last watering hole where a pirate might be found. I'll bluster and I'll bellow and make out like we're looking for the wretches who ransacked our hideout. But what you'll be doing is seeking out more of those strange tales, as you call them. You'll prod, poke, and ask questions, just like you always do, if we're lucky. we'll start to see some patterns, some rhyme and reason to it all. Maybe even learn about somewhere we can see some of this magic for ourselves. Are you talking about breaking up the crew? Mercia challenged him. The others signed up for excitement and adventure on the high seas. I'm not so sure they even believe there's anything unexplained out there to find. We're stronger together, Ramsey said emphatically. Besides, what pirate could say no to a tour of local drinking dens? Who knows? They may overhear something useful. We'll tell them what we're planning, then? Ramsey scratched his beard for a moment, mulling this over. Only that we're going hunting for the ones who robbed us, he said at last. We've lost more than our fair share in recent weeks. The fewer people who know what we're searching for, the more likely we are to lay our hands on it. It's no use, Mercia realized. I'm not going to be able to talk him out of this. Not now that he's got the idea in his head. Out loud, she said, and if you do find some of this so-called magic you're so desperate to see for yourself, what are you going to do then? Ramsey smiled grimly. What any pirate would do, of course. I'm going to steal it. Despite her reservations, the crew spent the next few days sailing from outpost to outpost, arriving just as the sun was setting and the taverns were at their liveliest. Having stopped at a few old haunts along the way and put their shovels to work, they'd reclaimed several stashes of gold and jewels, enough for Mercia to ply tight-tongued pirates with as much drink as was necessary to get them talking. Almost everyone, as it turned out, had some fanciful tale to tell. One grizzled pirate, bare to the waist and coated with a fine spider web of tattoos, claimed to have discovered the phantom of some long-forgotten emperor within the crumbling ruins of an overgrown palace. He had, he insisted to the pub at large, been appointed the old ghost's successor, and was thusly natural heir to the Sea of Thieves. His attempts to extract tributes from his subjects in the tavern had seen him firstly mocked, then batted aside, then finally pummeled and thrown into a nearby stream to sober up. Others spoke of musical instruments that had begun to play themselves after a layover on a distant island, or a cup that could never be drained. But when pressed for specifics, it was remarkable how few of them could remember what had happened to these miraculous belongings. Through it all, Ramsey threatened and swaggered, describing with gruesome detail what he'd do to the cowardly crew who had robbed him of his rightful hoard, while Shan and Rathbone lurked in the background, both bored and bemused at the nightly routine. Rathbone in particular seemed dissatisfied with the lack of treasure flowing their way, and began excusing himself earlier and earlier each evening. It was not until the fifth night that Mercia learned of anything that seemed even remotely plausible. She was squeezed into the corner of a bustling tavern, forced to share a table with an elderly pirate whose rheumy eyes had assessed Mercia with a keen intelligence as she took her seat. The woman was far and away the oldest person Mercia had seen upon the Sea of Thieves. Her wizened face was partially obscured by stray wisps of iron-grey hair, and her chin jutted forward like the prow of a galleon. The old woman said nothing by way of greeting, but sipped periodically from a bottle filled with a clear and sparkling liquid. Mercia couldn't remember seeing any pirate, young or old, come to a tavern craving anything other than grog in their bellies, and at last her inquisitiveness overrode her desire to monitor the crowd's conversations. "That's an interesting choice of drink," she commented, continuing to scan the room offhandedly. "Is it alcohol?" The old woman gave a low and melodious chuckle, her voice a stark contrast to her wizened appearance. My love, no. I swore off the stuff years ago. This is my special spring water, found on our last voyage. I've taken quite a fancy to it. and it fizzes just the same." She poured a small measure into an empty tankard for Mercia to try. Mercia sipped. "Not bad," she said diplomatically, though in truth, the taste put her in mind of the privy. "Not quite the magical elixir I was hoping for, though." The old woman's eyes creased into a smile. "Magic comes in all shapes and sizes out here," she answered coyly. "On that same voyage, we sailed right to the rim of the Devil's Shroud and found ourselves making camp on a tiny beach. It was barely even an island, not worth a name, but there was a sinkhole at its center. Well, I'd barely been at the cooking pot 5 minutes when my daughter's calling to me. 'Ma'am, look what's down here.'" Mercia wasn't in the mood for an old woman's gossip, but something about the story seemed curiously plausible compared to the far-flung fantasies she was used to hearing in places like this. She found herself leaning forward, focusing intently on her companion for the first time. "And?" she pressed. "When I was younger, my Charlie would take me dancing," the old woman said wistfully. "Even one brave night, to a prince's reception at the palace. Oh, I'd never in my life seen such splendor. So when I tell you that the grand hall my girl showed me made that royal ballroom look like a pig pen, you'll know I don't mean it lightly." She took another draught of her bubbling beverage before continuing. "A chamber fit for a king, hidden under the waves, at the heart of some flooded caves, and lit by an eerie fire we'd never seen the likes of. We didn't have to light our own path, you understand? The torches were already burning, though there wasn't a spot of kindling to be seen. An eternal flame," Mercia mused. "A common legend all the way back to the Promethean original. But it was an odd thing to boast about discovering, nonetheless. You couldn't get rich from fire." She decided she'd listened long enough. "And I suppose when you woke up the next day, there was no trace of this mysterious chamber," she challenged. For this was where the stories she endured tended to collapse into rumor and excuses. "Of course there was," said the old woman, so sharply that Mercia actually flushed. "I made a very detailed map, in fact. I was planning to pay the place another visit, see what else I could learn." "You did?" Mercia struggled to keep the impatience from her voice, for she'd been led along like this too many times in recent days. "And you know where the map is right now?" "Certainly I do," the woman replied icily. "I'm not daft, you know." "Sorry. It'll be in the wreck of our galleon, I should think." The old woman leaned back and began to fumble with a tobacco pouch. "We lost her in a firefight the next day. I've not been out to sea since. I'm too old to be salvaging scuttled ships. Not at my time of life." She sighed, and then fixed Mercia with a crafty stare. "But if you've got a ship of your own, you could find the map for yourself." Tenuous though the tale was, it was the closest thing to success Mercia had enjoyed all week, and she gladly bade the old woman tell her everything she could remember about the location of her abandoned vessel. Bidding her farewell, she forced her way to the bar where Ramsey was holding court and firmly gripped his arm, even as he made to curse once again those who had plundered his hideout. "It's time to leave," she said firmly. "There's a chance I found something, a slim chance," she added at once, sensing his immediate change in mood and unwilling to raise his hopes too high. Ramsey, though, was too full of residual merriment not to take the good news at face value. "I'll take it," he roared, staggering through the throng behind Mercia and spilling several people's drinks as he did so. "It's about time fortune was on our side. What are we searching for, eh?" "That," Mercia said diplomatically as she towed Ramsey through the tavern door and down toward the dock, "is very much a conversation for tomorrow." Mercia had returned to the ship, feeling curiously hopeful, looking forward to getting back out on the waves after days spent in smoky taverns. Ramsey, once his head had cleared, was more cautious. He gave a terse, curated explanation of their destination to Shan and Rathbone, saying simply that they'd learned of a shipwreck loaded with valuable treasures. Privately, Mercia wondered if perhaps Ramsey's newfound interest in the supernatural was waning already. But she had no chance to put her question to him once they were out at sea. Their journey was a stormy one, and the driving rain pushed all other concerns out of their minds as they battled through to sunrise, until finally Mercia found herself clinging to the side of the Magpie's wing, staring down at the broken husk of a galleon upon the seabed. The sun was high, and the water was clear. Even from here, she could make out the gaping wounds that had sunk the little ship. She'd have to swim through the largest of these to find the chest, assuming it still lay where the old woman had promised. No time like the present, she thought, and plunged herself into the sea, kicking off from the hull of the Magpie's wing and diving toward the waiting wreck. She passed Rathbone as she descended, as he was on his third trip to the surface, both for air and to drop off the spoils from the captain's cabin. She waved cheerfully, but he ignored her, focusing his gaze on the foamy waves overhead. The ruined ship had come to rest almost upside down, its masts having been sheared away by cannon fire in the battle that sunk her. As she eased herself through a gap in the rotting planks, Mercia found herself in an environment that was both strangely familiar and entirely alien, thanks to everything being inverted. Barrels and boxes that had been securely tied to the floor now hung ominously overhead, their looming bulk threatening to topple down upon her should any of the ropes and netting choose that moment to give way. Below her, a hatchway to where the stairs had once been led up. Down, she reminded herself, to the middle deck. Once her eyes had adjusted to the gloom, Mercia began to poke around, looking for anything that might resemble the outline of the chest the woman had described. She found it after a moment's exploration, small and unassuming, gilded with iron. Tugging it free was more of an effort than she expected, and Mercia was forced to tilt her head back and press her face up toward the inverted floor, finding a small pocket of trapped air she could use to replenish her breath. Once she'd filled her lungs, she dropped back down, preparing to haul the little chest back to the surface. And that was when she saw the shark. It was visible through the battered hull, only for an instant. One deadly eye staring right at her as it passed by the hole she'd entered through. She waited, hardly daring to move, hoping that it had failed to sense her as anything more than a shape in the darkness. No such luck. The beast had swum in a wide circle, and now she could see it approaching once again, eager to enjoy an unexpected meal. It looked old, with scars crisscrossing its body, and huge, too. So huge, Mercia wondered if it would even fit through the gap in the hull, or if it would simply become wedged, trapping her within the ship and snapping angrily as she drowned just out of its reach. Deciding not to wait around to find out, Mercia grabbed the chest and used its weight to help her drop down through the hatchway, deeper into the ship. Overhead, she could hear the crashing of splintered wood as the beast collided with the wreck, trapping itself only briefly before it was able to force its way inside the battered hull. Fighting a rising tide of panic, Mercia looked around for something she could use. Much in this room was familiar too, though this ship's map table had toppled, managing to become wedged against the stairwell. It looked like oak, too heavy to move, too sturdy to shatter, and it was blocking the hatch that led to the ship's upper deck, cutting off her only means of escape. She began a frantic circuit of the room, hunting for a weapon or a way out. fearing that any moment the great grey face would poke through the hatchway and bear down on her. Wriggling through the tangle of hammocks and ropes that separated this deck's front from its aft, Mercia's attention was caught by a tiny minnow as it zigzagged out between two crates. Startled by her approach, it and two others flitted past her nose and squeezed through another breach at the rear of the ship, one she hadn't noticed until now. It was barely a foot across, but it was a lifeline nonetheless. Bracing her back against a beam, Mercia used the only thing she had at hand and began to repeatedly smash the silver chest against the hull. Her lungs ached more with every passing second as she used up her precious breath. And at first it seemed as though her assault was having little effect, but finally, one plank broke away. Another strike and a second followed it. Something touched her body as she pulled back to deliver another blow, and with a shudder of revulsion, she realized it was the head of the shark. It was thrashing, blinded and flummoxed by a hammock that had become wrapped across its snout as it had approached her. If not for the momentary protection of a flimsy piece of netting, Mercia might have lost an arm. Desperate now, she struck again and again, widening the hole as much as she could, before finally hauling herself and her prize through the breach. The arm of her shirt snagged on a nail as she made to flee the wreck, pinning her momentarily to the hull, and she tugged and wrenched with all her might until the sleeve tore up to the shoulder and released her. Stubbornly refusing to abandon the heavy chest, even as dark redness licked around the edges of her vision, Mercia kicked out with the last of her strength. She was grimly aware that she wasn't going to make it to the surface before she lost consciousness, at which point the weight of the box would drag her back down into the icy depths. She closed her eyes, furious at her own pride, and that was when she felt strong hands grip under her arms, helping speed her the last of the way back to where there was air and sunlight and life. Once Mercia had been helped safely back aboard, vomiting what felt like a small lake's worth of seawater over the deck as she sucked in deep, blissful gulps of air, Ramsey turned his attention to the chest she'd salvaged. It was locked, as he'd expected, and so he took the helm and set a course to the nearest outpost. As soon as they docked, Ramsey went ashore alone, with the silver chest tucked under his arm, leaving the others to take their ease. He'd hoped for a blacksmith, but had to make do with a lanky shipwright whose hammer and chisel made short work of the lock on the chest. Tipping gold into the craftsman's palm and thanking him for the favor, Ramsey returned to the ship and invited the crew into the captain's cabin. Once unsealed, the chest turned out to be filled mostly with a selection of milky white pearls, along with a handful of gems and gold coins. Rathbone scoffed, remarking that it had been hardly worth Mercia risking life and limb for little more than a necklace. But she ignored him and groped around at the very bottom of the chest, until she felt the rough texture of a parchment lurking beneath the jewels. Just as the old woman had promised, it contained detailed instructions for finding both the island and its hidden chamber beneath, and she pored over it eagerly. The Magpie's wings set sail at once on Ramsey's orders, and Shan was at the wheel when Rathbone, who should have been taking his turn in the crow's nest until they sighted land, approached him. "I suppose our illustrious captain and his new favorite are having yet another heart-to-heart below deck," he sneered, spitting over the side, as if he'd a sour taste in his mouth. "I suppose," Shan said evenly. He made no effort to continue the conversation, and Rathbone made as if to walk away in frustration, only to spin on his heel and continue. "When I signed up, it was to be a full part of this crew, and that includes getting a say on where we sail and why. What are we even looking for? If you ask me, Ramsey's been cracked ever since we left Thieves' Haven." "I didn't ask," Shan said, then turned to meet Rathbone's gaze for the first time. "But I will say that we are low on supplies, and travelling here and there and everywhere isn't helping matters. When we next make camp, that might be a good time to talk."
"I've had enough talking to last a lifetime,"
Rathbone exploded.
"All Ramsey does is talk. There's gold out there. Gold that's slipping through our fingers and into other people's purses every day we're out here sailing in circles."
"We'll talk," Shan said firmly, tugging at the wheel perhaps slightly harder than necessary so that the ship lurched.
"And if we don't like what we hear?"
Rathbone persisted, but Shan had turned his gaze back to the sea, for their destination had come into view. Shan gave a piercing whistle that echoed through the whole ship, and a moment later, Ramsey and Mercia had joined them above deck. The old woman's description had been accurate indeed, for the island was little more than a series of sandy rings poking out of the water, concentric circles around a single fissure that cut deep into the seabed. They weighed anchor and disembarked, the seawater barely reaching their knees as they approached the island's center. And it was here, Ramsey explained, that he and Mercia would be the ones to explore down below. Upon learning that he and Shan would remain behind once more, Rathbone looked thunderous. Privately, Mercia wasn't looking forward to diving again so soon, though she drew some comfort knowing that Ramsey would be alongside her. It looked strange to see him shorn of his usual hat, boots, and greatcoat, but he wasted no time in hauling himself into the pit and vanishing into the sparkling waters. Grimacing, Mercia did the same, and together they dove down into the rocky labyrinth, carefully following the directions they'd memorized. They made a left turn, and then a right, then a sharp left, passing through a narrow gap that Ramsey could barely squeeze his broad shoulders through. As they swam ever onward, Ramsey took the lead with a series of powerful breaststrokes. His excitement was mounting, for the tunnel was growing lighter, not darker, and the way ahead was outlined by an unearthly blue light. Where Ramsey felt anticipation, however, Mercia felt a growing sense of unease, for she could hear a strange, keening sound that seemed to echo from the passages they hadn't explored. Every time she thought she knew which of the many tunnels must be the source of the eerie noise, it seemed to shift and twist away somehow. Still, they swam, and now the floor of the tunnel was curving upward. Their heads broke water, and then they were paddling and eventually wading as they took the final soggy steps up the sloping passage. At last, they had reached their destination. The hall in which they had arrived was both imposing and beautiful, making its location deep underneath the shoreline of some unknown island all the more intriguing. The floor beneath their bare feet was a lattice of mosaics, blues and greens and all the colors of the ocean represented by tiny stone trails that whirled and danced in complicated patterns. Fluted pillars carried the eye up to a high, vaulted ceiling where carved frescoes were fighting a losing battle against limestone stalactites that had formed in the years since the chamber was completed. The center of the room was dominated by a large basin that appeared to connect back to the maze of flooded passages. The intricate patterns on the floor seemed to cluster and unite around the pool's perimeter, as if to signify its importance. But Ramsey paid it little heed. His attention had been captured by the ghostly blue flames that burned in braziers spread throughout the mammoth chamber. Just as the elderly pirate had described, these flames persisted with no apparent source of fuel, seemingly able to endure the ravages of time regardless. They were magical, Ramsey knew, and he reached out as if making to cup one in his palm, only to discover that the burning lights were no mere illusion. He yanked his hand back and sucked at his fingers, swearing and grumbling. Mercia ignored him, for she was once again searching for the source of that keening, echoing wail. Ramsey's cursing seemed to have triggered it once more, louder than before, and she began to patrol the hall's perimeter, twisting her head this way and that as she attempted to track down the source of the sound. She wasn't entirely certain Ramsey could hear it at all. It was then that she spotted the earrings. 2 simple pearl studs, far plainer than the golden hoops she usually preferred, placed without much care or heed in a small recess. Had she not been searching so determinedly for the wailing sound, she might never have noticed them. It seemed an odd thing to leave behind, and she plucked them curiously between damp fingertips and held them up, examining them by the light of the impossible flames. She never knew what compelled her to delicately unhook her own earrings and slide the pearls into place. She could barely remember choosing to, but the moment she did, Mercia dropped to her knees, gasping as the keening wail began to shift and separate into a joyful chorus. 10,000 moons of silence and unanswered call, a grief-consuming kinship's sacred fire, a sadness at the parting and the statue's fall, to tender understanding all desire. In loving hearts shall be remembered fulsome feasts, when 2 were one, above and so below, returned with slash and snap of jaw as wounded beasts, a pain forgotten, freshly come to know. Song turns in darkest memory to times of play, the flames reborn to banish longest night. Through passages of harmony we make our way, so ancient wrong may be at last put right. "They're singing," Mercia gasped in delight, bringing her hands to her head. Ramsey strode over in concern, crouching before her transfixed form. His eyes narrowed as he noticed the pearl earrings, which seemed to be sparkling with an inner light all their own. When he made to pull them free, however, she swatted his hands away irritably. "Not now," she snapped. "They're almost here. They need us." "Who does? Who is singing to you?" Ramsey persisted, resisting the urge to tug Mercia to her feet and drag her outside, away from whatever seemed to be intoxicating her. A moment later, the central pool erupted in a shower of spray, and Ramsey got his answer. It had taken Shan 5 hours and an immense amount of self-control to calm Rathbone down, as he ranted and raved, stalking around the ship and cursing Ramsey's name. Finally, Shan resorted to opening the final cask of grog and plying him into a stupor. Now Rathbone lay by their campfire on a golden sandbar in the shadow of the magpie's wing, snoring loudly as he slept in a fetal position. Shan could feel himself starting to drift away out of boredom, his head growing heavier by the moment, and was therefore extremely gratified when a stream of bubbles announced Ramsey's return. He and Mercia staggered out of the pool, leaving a trail of muddy footprints across the sand, but neither made any attempt to come and dry out by the fire. Instead, they made straight for the magpie's wing. "No treasure, then?" Shan inquired. "Seems a shame." He stifled a yawn and nudged Rathbone in the ribs, slightly harder than was necessary. There was a choking snort as the slumbering pirate snapped back to consciousness and glanced blearily around. "Forget treasure," said Ramsey firmly. "This isn't about treasure. This is about helping friends." And with that, leaving Shan and Rathbone to exchange bewildered glances, Ramsey hauled himself up the ship's ladder and out of sight.